The first light of dawn crept across the gray-yellow grasslands of Dust Creek, painting the horizon in shades of copper and dust. The wind carried the dry scent of sage and the promise of another parched day. In the kitchen of the Kelter Ranch, Hester McCrae was already at work, her broad hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the early hour. The coffee pot gurgled on the cast-iron stove, filling the room with a rich, dark aroma that could wake the dead or at least rouse a dozen hungry cowboys. Hester measured out cornmeal for the day's bread, her movements careful but quick. She had learned long ago that the quiet hours before dawn belonged to her alone, a precious time when the world asked nothing of her except competence. "Coffee's thick enough that a horse could read scripture after drinking it," she murmured to herself, allowing a small smile. It was one of her private jokes, spoken to the empty kitchen like a prayer of normalcy. The kitchen door creaked, and Hester's shoulders tensed automatically, but it was only Jedediah Kelter, the owner of the ranch, ducking his massive frame through the doorway. At 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to brush both sides of the door frame. Jed was what the locals called built like a barn door. Yet, for all his size, he moved with surprising quietness. "Morning, Mrs. McCrae," he said, his voice low and rumbling like distant thunder. He carried a toolbox and headed straight for the loose hinge on the pantry door that had been squeaking for a week. "Morning, Mr. Kelter," Hester replied, automatically tugging her long sleeves down to her wrists. "Coffee's nearly ready." Jed nodded, already focused on the hinge. He was a man of few words, which suited Hester fine. In the 3 months since she'd taken the position as cook, they'd developed a comfortable routine of minimal conversation and mutual respect for each other's silence. As she kneaded dough for the morning biscuits, Hester watched him from the corner of her eye. Unlike her husband Dawson, Jed never demanded immediate attention or service. He simply fixed what needed fixing and went about his business. It was peaceful. "Heard tell the railroad's sending a man through," Jed said after a while, his voice casual but with an underlying tension. "Name of Whitlow, fancy talker from back east." Hester's hand stilled for a moment in the dough. "Railroad's been promising to come through Dust Creek for years," she said carefully. "Different this time. Maybe." Jed tightened a screw with deliberate precision. "They're buying up land along the proposed route, offering prices that sound good until you read the fine print." The kitchen filled with the sounds of morning, the pop of wood in the stove, the whistle of the coffee pot, the rhythmic scrape of Jed's tools. Outside, the first of the ranch hands were stirring in the bunkhouse. Soon, they'd pile in for breakfast, filling the kitchen with rough jokes and the clatter of tin plates. "Your husband coming by today?" Jed asked, the question seemingly casual, but weighted with unspoken concern. Hester's jaw tightened. "Don't know. He's been busy in town." Busy losing money at cards? She didn't add, busy drinking away what little they had saved. Busy being angry at the world and taking it out on whoever was closest. "Man ought to appreciate a good cook," Jed said, still focused on the hinge. "Especially one who can make hardtack taste like Sunday dinner." Despite herself, Hester felt a flush of pride. "Just flour and water and knowing what to do with them," she said. "Nothing special." "Everything's special when it's done right," Jed countered, standing up and testing the door. It swung silently now. "There, that'll hold." He gathered his tools and paused at the kitchen door. "Mrs. McCrae, if you ever need, that is, if there's trouble," he cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the personal nature of what he was trying to say. "The Kelter Ranch looks after its own." Before Hester could respond, he was gone, leaving only the lingering scent of leather and honest work. She stood there for a moment, hands covered in flour, wondering at the unexpected warmth his words had kindled in her chest. Then she shook her head and returned to her biscuits. She'd learned not to lean too hard on kindness. It had a way of collapsing when you needed it most. The ranch hands began filtering in as the sun broke the horizon. Silas Crow first, as always. The young mixed-blood cowboy had an uncanny ability to predict weather and an equally uncanny appetite. He sniffed the air appreciatively. "Storm coming," he announced, helping himself to coffee. "Maybe 2 days out. Dust storm, from the smell of it, electric-like." "Your nose is more reliable than the farmer's almanac," said Tom Brennan, an older hand with graying temples. "Remember last spring when you called that blue norther 3 days early?" "That's 'cause I pay attention," Silas said with a grin. "Sky talks if you know how to listen." More men filed in, filling their plates with biscuits and gravy, fried eggs, and thick slabs of bacon. The conversation turned to the usual topics: the health of the cattle, the state of the grass, speculation about the railroad. Hester moved among them, refilling coffee cups and platters, comfortable in her role as provider. "Hey, Cookie," called out a young hand named Billy, using the traditional ranch nickname for the cook. "These biscuits are so light they might float away. You trying to fatten us up for market?" "Keep talking, Billy, and tomorrow's biscuits will be hard enough to use for fence posts," Hester shot back, earning a round of laughter. This was when she felt most like herself: useful, competent, even appreciated. The men treated her with a rough courtesy that had nothing to do with her appearance or her husband's reputation. To them, she was Cookie, the woman who kept them fed, and that was enough. Mabel Dunn arrived just as the hands were heading out for the morning's work. The general store owner drove her own wagon, handling the reins with the same no-nonsense efficiency she brought to everything else. A woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. Mabel was one of the few people in Dust Creek who said exactly what she thought. Consequences be damned. "Hester, I need 3 dozen eggs and whatever butter you can spare," she called out, climbing down from the wagon with surprising agility. "Got a big order from the hotel. That Whitlow fellow's bringing a whole delegation. Apparently, plans to wine and dine half the county." "I'll pack them up," Hester said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Coffee?" "Won't say no." Mabel settled herself at the kitchen table like she owned it. "So, what do you make of this railroad business?" "Not my place to make anything of it," Hester said carefully, gathering eggs into a basket. "Horse feathers. Everything that affects Dust Creek affects us all." Mabel's keen eyes studied Hester's face. "That husband of yours been talking about it. Heard he's been spending time with some of Whitlow's advance men." Hester's movements became very precise as she wrapped each egg in old newspaper. "Dawson doesn't discuss business with me." "Man's a fool then," Mabel said bluntly. "You've got more sense in your little finger than he's got in his whole body. Speaking of which, where is he? Haven't seen him around the ranch lately." "He had business in town," Hester said, the words coming out by rote. It was the same excuse she'd been making for weeks now, ever since Dawson's gambling had spiraled from bad to worse. Mabel made a sound that could have meant anything. "Well, you tell him from me that his credit at the store is getting stretched mighty thin. I'm not running a charity, much as I like you." The word stung, but Hester kept her face neutral. "I'll tell him." "You do that." Mabel stood, smoothing her skirts. "And Hester, you ever need anything at all, you come see me. Sometimes a woman needs another woman to talk to." After Mabel left with her eggs and butter, Hester stood in the empty kitchen, feeling the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on her shoulders. She rolled up her sleeves to wash the dishes, then quickly rolled them back down, catching sight of the fading yellow-green bruise on her forearm. It was from last week, when Dawson had gripped her arm too hard while demanding money she didn't have. The sound of hoofbeats drew her to the window. A group of riders was approaching men in city clothes despite the dust, led by a thin man with pomaded hair that gleamed in the morning sun. That must be Whitlow, she thought. He rode like someone who'd learned in a riding academy, all proper posture and no feel for the horse. Jed emerged from the barn to meet them. and Hester couldn't help but notice the contrast Jed solid and still as a mountain. Whitlow gesturing and talking with his hands like he was conducting an orchestra. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in Jed's shoulders. "Nothing good comes of it when the railroad men show up," she muttered, turning away from the window. There was lunch to prepare, and supper after that. The work never stopped, which was how she preferred it. Busy hands kept the mind from wandering down dangerous paths. As she peeled potatoes for the noon meal, Hester allowed herself one moment of weakness, one fleeting wish that things could be different. Then she pushed it aside and got on with the business of surviving another day in Dust Creek. The sun climbed higher, baking the earth and drawing the moisture from everything it touched. In the distance, a dust devil whirled across the prairie like a restless spirit. Change was coming to Dust Creek. Hester could feel it in her bones, the way Silas could smell a storm. Whether it would bring salvation or destruction remained to be seen. For now, there was only the kitchen, the work, and the small sanctuary she'd carved out in these pre-dawn hours. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and in a life full of uncertainties, that would have to be enough. The midday sun beat down mercilessly as Hester loaded the chuck wagon with provisions for the crew working on the new fence posts near the proposed railroad markers. The men needed feeding, and it was easier to bring the meal to them than have them trek back to the ranch house. She'd packed cold biscuits, dried beef, pickles, and a pot of beans that could be reheated over a campfire. The ride out to the fence line was peaceful. The only sounds the creak of wagon wheels and the steady plod of the draft horse's hooves. Hester had always found a kind of solace in these solitary journeys across the prairie, where the sky stretched endless and her troubles seemed smaller against the vast landscape. She could see the work crew in the distance, their figures shimmering in the heat haze. Among them were the railroad surveyors, marking out the potential route with stakes and colored flags. As she drew closer, she heard raised voices and argument brewing. "I'm telling you, Pike, you can't just move those markers." One of the railroad men was shouting, his face red with anger and heat. Hester's stomach dropped. Dawson was there, swaying slightly on his feet despite the early hour. His shirt was rumpled, his hat pushed back at an aggressive angle, and even from 20 feet away, she could smell the whiskey on him. "Don't tell me what I can and can't do," Dawson snarled, kicking at one of the survey stakes. "This is still free country, ain't it?" "Mrs. McCrae?" Silas appeared at her elbow. Having jogged over from the work crew, his usually cheerful face was tight with concern. "Maybe you should stay in the wagon." But it was too late. Dawson had spotted her, and his bloodshot eyes narrowed. Well, if it ain't my loving wife, come to check on me." His voice dripped with sarcasm. "Or maybe you're checking on someone else that big rancher been sniffing around you." "I brought lunch for the crew," Hester said quietly, keeping her voice steady despite the blood rushing in her ears. "That's all." "That's all? She says." Dawson stumbled toward her, and the other men shifted uncomfortably, acting all high and mighty, like you're better than me, like you don't owe me respect. Mr. Pike," one of the older ranch hands, Tom Brennan, stepped forward. "The lady's just doing her job. No call to stay out of this, old man." Dawson whirled on him, then back to Hester. "Get down here, now!" Hester climbed down from the wagon slowly, her hands gripping the wooden sides. She knew that look in his eyes, knew what it meant. But there were witnesses here. Surely he wouldn't. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist with bruising force. "You're making me look bad," he hissed, low enough that only she could hear. "Parading around, acting like you run things. You're my wife, mine. Don't you forget it." "Dawson, please," she whispered. "People are watching." "So, let them watch." His grip tightened, and she couldn't suppress a small gasp of pain. Maybe they need reminding, too. A man's got rights. A man's got... "Mr. Pike." The voice cracked like a whip across the prairie. Everyone turned to see Jed Coulter approaching on horseback, his face carved from granite. He dismounted in one smooth motion, and though he moved without haste, there was something in his bearing that made Dawson release Hester's wrist. "Mr. Coulter," Dawson attempted a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Just having a word with my wife, private-like." "Nothing private about it when you're doing it in front of my work crew," Jed said evenly. His eyes flicked to Hester, taking in her protective stance, the way she cradled her wrist. "Mrs. McCrae, the men are waiting on their lunch. Best see to it." "You don't give my wife orders," Dawson started, but Jed cut him off. "On my land, during my work hours, I give orders to everyone." His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. "Including you. If you plan on staying, which I don't recommend, seeing as you're disrupting the work." For a moment, the two men stared at each other, Dawson swaying slightly, trying to puff himself up to match Jed's height and failing. Jed standing solid as an oak tree. The work crew watched in tense silence. Then Mabel Dunn's wagon came rattling up, breaking the standoff. She took in the scene with one sharp glance and immediately inserted herself into the situation. "Mr. Pike, what fortuitous timing," she called out cheerfully, though her eyes were hard. "I was just heading to town, and I believe you wanted to discuss your account at the store. Why don't you ride with me? Save you the walk." It was a lifeline disguised as a business proposition. Dawson looked between Mabel, Jed, and Hester, his face flushing darker. "I don't need—" "Actually, I insist," Mabel said, her tone brooking no argument. "That account won't settle itself, and I have other stops to make. Come along now." Somehow, through a combination of Mabel's forceful personality and the unified disapproval of the work crew, Dawson found himself bundled into Mabel's wagon. As they drove away, he shot one last venomous look at Hester. "This ain't over," he called out. "A man's got rights." The crew dispersed back to their work, uncomfortable with what they'd witnessed. Hester busied herself with setting out the food, her hands trembling slightly. She could feel Jed hovering nearby, wanting to say something but not knowing how. "Thank you," she said quietly, not looking at him, "for stepping in." "Shouldn't have had to," he replied gruffly. "Man treats his horse better than that." "I'm fine." The words came automatically. "He's just having a hard time. The debts and the pressure." "Mrs. McCrae." Jed's voice was gentle but firm. "You don't have to make excuses. Not to me, not to anyone." She finally looked up at him, and the understanding in his eyes nearly undid her. She'd gotten so used to people looking the other way, pretending not to see. That simple acknowledgement felt like a gift. "The beans are getting cold," she said, retreating to safer ground. "Better call the men." The rest of the lunch passed without incident. The men ate heartily, carefully avoiding any mention of the earlier confrontation. Silas tried to lighten the mood with a story about a horse that could supposedly count to 10, and gradually the tension eased. As Hester packed up the empty pots, she noticed the bruises already forming on her wrist, perfect finger marks in purple and blue. She quickly pulled her sleeve down, but not before Jed saw. His jaw tightened, but he didn't comment. "I'll drive you back," he said instead. "Silas can bring my horse." "That's not necessary." "It is." His tone left no room for argument. "That's my wagon and my horse. I'll see them safely back." The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Jed handled the reins with easy competence, his large frame making the wagon seat seem small. Hester sat as far from him as the bench allowed, acutely aware of every bump and sway that shifted her closer. "My wife died 5 years ago," Jed said suddenly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Fever took her. We were only married 2 years." Hester didn't know what to say to this unexpected confidence. "She was a tiny thing," he continued. "Barely came up to my chest. People used to joke about us, call us the giant and the fairy. But she was stronger than she looked, stronger than me, in ways that counted. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. What I'm trying to say, Mrs. McCrae, is that I know something about loss, about things not turning out how you planned, but I also know that no one deserves to be treated poorly, no matter what their circumstances. Mr. Coulter, I'm not asking for explanations or confidences, he said quickly. Just want you to know that the offer stands. The Coulter Ranch looks after its own. If you need help, any kind of help, you ask. They were approaching the ranch now, and Hester could see smoke rising from the kitchen chimney. She'd need to start preparing supper soon, lose herself in the familiar routine of cooking. He wasn't always like this, she heard herself say. When we first married, he had such dreams. We both did. The frontier was going to be our fresh start, our chance to build something. But the land out here, it's harder than he expected. Harder than either of us expected. Land doesn't make a man mean, Jed said quietly. It just reveals what was already there. The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. She'd been making excuses for so long, blaming circumstances, bad luck, the harsh prairie life. But other men face the same challenges without turning cruel. As Jed helped her down from the wagon, his hands were gentle on her waist, careful not to touch her bruised wrist. For a moment they stood close, and she could smell leather and hay and honest sweat. Then she stepped back, flustered. Thank you for the ride, she said formally. He touched the brim of his hat. Ma'am. That evening, as Hester served supper to the ranch hands, she overheard them talking in low voices. Did you see how Pike grabbed her? Billy was saying. Right in front of everyone, bold as brass. Man's got no shame. Tom agreed. And getting worse, that whiskey's eating him from the inside out. Someone ought to do something, another hand muttered. And what exactly would you have us do? Tom asked. Law says a man can discipline his wife. Sheriff Hart won't step in unless there's killing involved. Don't seem right, Billy insisted. Cookie's a good woman, works hard, never complains. World's full of things that ain't right, Tom said heavily. Doesn't mean we can fix them all. Hester retreated to the kitchen, their words echoing in her ears. She knew they meant well, but their helplessness only emphasized her own. The law, society. Even good men like these, they all agreed that what happened between husband and wife was private business. Later that night, as she cleaned up the kitchen, Hester allowed herself a moment of weakness. She sank into a chair, cradling her bruised wrist, and let a few tears fall. Not many she'd learned that crying solved nothing but enough to ease the pressure in her chest. Tomorrow, Dawson would likely return, angrier than ever about being humiliated. Tomorrow, she'd have to face whatever consequences his wounded pride demanded. But tonight, in her kitchen, with the memory of Jed's gentle hands and Mabel's fierce intervention, she felt a tiny spark of something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Not quite hope. She wasn't foolish enough for that. But maybe, just maybe, the beginning of believing she deserved better. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. In the distance, heat lightning flickered across the prairie sky. Silas had been right, a storm was coming. Whether it would bring relief or more destruction remained to be seen. The tension in Dust Creek grew thick as the prairie dust. Whitlow had set up operations in the hotel, his team of surveyors and lawyers spreading through town like locusts in pinstripe suits. Every day brought new rumors the railroad would make everyone rich. The railroad would steal their land. The railroad would bring civilization. The railroad would destroy their way of life. Hester watched it all from her kitchen sanctuary. But even here she couldn't escape the mounting pressure. The ranch hands talked of nothing else during meals, and Jed grew quieter with each passing day. The weight of difficult decisions etched in the lines around his eyes. Whitlow's offering 3 times what the land's worth. Tom Brennan announced one morning over coffee. The Hendersons already sold, packed up and headed east yesterday. 3 times nothing is still nothing if you can't buy land anywhere else, Silas countered. sopping up egg yolk with his biscuit. "Where we gonna run cattle if every acre's got train tracks on it?" "Progress," Billy said, trying out the word like it was foreign on his tongue. "That's what Whitlow calls it. Says we can't stand in the way of progress." Progress. Jed spoke for the first time that morning, his voice flat. Funny how progress always seems to require somebody giving up what they've worked for. The kitchen door banged open, making everyone jump, but it was only Martha Washington, the widow from the edge of town. She stood there trembling, her thin shawl inadequate against the morning chill. "Mrs. McCrae," she gasped. "I'm sorry to barge in, but I didn't know where else to go. My last chicken died, and I haven't eaten in 2 days, and Mr. Whitlow's men say I have to be off my land by week's end if I don't sign their papers." Without hesitation, Hester guided the woman to a chair and pressed a cup of hot coffee into her hands. "Sit, eat." She loaded a plate with biscuits, eggs, and bacon. "Tell me everything, but slowly." As Martha's story unfolded, a widow's portion of land suddenly valuable, pressure to sell, veiled threats about accidents that might befall those who refused. Hester felt a cold anger building in her chest. She glanced at Jed, who was listening with darkening expression. "You'll stay here today," Hester declared, refilling Martha's plate. "Rest, get warm, we'll figure something out." "I couldn't impose." "It's not imposing, it's neighboring." Hester's tone brooked no argument. "Mr. Calter, might Martha rest in the spare room off the kitchen just until we sort things out?" Jed nodded immediately. "Of course. And Mrs. Washington, no one's forcing you off your land, not while I have breath in my body." After the men left for the day's work, Hester settled Martha in the small room that served as storage and occasional guest quarters. As she gathered extra blankets, she found herself thinking about sanctuary, about the way her kitchen had become a refuge not just for her, but for others. The day passed in ordinary tasks: bread to bake, vegetables to prepare, stock to simmer, but Hester's mind churned. She thought about Martha, about the other small landholders being pressured, about the way money and power moved through their community like a poison. That afternoon, Mabel arrived with her weekly supply run. She took one look at Hester's face and demanded, "What's happened now?" Hester told her about Martha, about the threats. Mabel's expression grew thunderous. "Those railroad jackals," she spat. "Picking off the weakest first, like wolves culling a herd. Well, they haven't reckoned with the women of Dust Creek." She paused, studying Hester. "How's that wrist?" Hester automatically tugged her sleeve down. "Fine." Mabel didn't look convinced. "And Dawson, he been around?" "Not for 2 days. Not since the scene at the fence line." Hester didn't know if she was relieved or worried. Dawson's absences usually meant he was deeper in debt, drowning his failures in whiskey and cards. "Well, when he does show up, you send word." Mabel's hand briefly covered Hester's. "I mean it. Some things a woman shouldn't face alone." That evening, as Hester served supper, she noticed Jed's chair empty. Silas explained he'd ridden to town to meet with the other ranchers. "Trying to form some kind of alliance," the young cowboy said. "Strength in numbers and all that." Near midnight, Hester was banking the kitchen fires when she heard horses approaching. Multiple horses, riding hard. She grabbed the shotgun from behind the door Jed had taught her to shoot, insisted on it, and peered out the window. It was Jed, but he wasn't alone. Sheriff Abel Hart rode beside him, and both men looked grim. They dismounted near the kitchen door, and Hester quickly let them in. "Sorry to disturb you, Mrs. McCrae," the sheriff said, removing his hat. He was a thin man in his 40s, with the perpetual worried look of someone trying to keep peace in a lawless land. "But I need to ask you some questions about your husband." Hester's blood ran cold. "Has something happened to Dawson?" "No, ma'am, but something's happened because of him." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "There was an altercation at the saloon tonight. Your husband accused Mr. Whitlow of cheating at cards. Pulled a knife. Nobody was hurt," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "But Whitlow's pressing charges. And Dawson claimed you'd been stealing from the Calter Ranch to pay his debts. Said you had a whole scheme going, skimming from the food budget." The words hit Hester like physical blows. She sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. "That's not true. I would never—" "I know." Jed's voice was firm. "I told the sheriff as much. Showed him the account books. Everything's in perfect order. Has been since you started." Problem is," Sheriff Hart continued, "Dawson's making a lot of noise. Says he'll testify that you and Mr. Calter here have an understanding. That you're both profiting from railroad speculation using ranch funds." "That's a lie." The words burst from Hester with surprising force. "Dawson's the one who's been meeting with Whitlow's agents. He's the one trying to profit. I heard him talking about it, making deals." She stopped, realizing she'd said too much. The two men exchanged glances. "Would you be willing to swear to that in court?" the sheriff asked gently. Hester's brief defiance crumbled. Testify against her husband? The law wouldn't look kindly on that. A wife who turned against her husband was worse than a thief in most people's eyes. I don't know." "You don't have to decide tonight," Jed said. "Sheriff, what happens now?" "I've got Dawson in a cell, sleeping it off. Whitlow wants his pound of flesh, but he might be convinced to drop charges if—" He hesitated. "If certain land deals go through." Jed's expression was knowing. "So that's the game. Create trouble, then offer to make it go away for the right price." "I can't prove that's what's happening," Sheriff Hart said carefully. "But a lawman notices patterns." After the sheriff left, Jed lingered. Hester stood at the stove, mechanically making tea she didn't want, just to have something to do with her hands. "This is my fault," she said quietly. "I brought this trouble to your door. I should leave, find work elsewhere." "Don't!" She turned, startled by the vehemence in his voice. "Don't run," Jed continued more quietly. "That's what they want, Whitlow, Dawson, all of them. They want to scatter us, break us apart so they can pick over the pieces. But the ranch, your reputation, my reputation can handle the truth, which is that I employ an honest cook who's being slandered by a drunk gambler." He paused, seeming to wrestle with words. "Mrs. McCrae, Hester, you're not alone in this. Not anymore." The use of her first name hung in the air between them. It was improper, too familiar, but somehow it felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "I should check on Martha," Hester said, retreating from the intensity of the moment. "Of course, but think about what I said. Running isn't the answer. Standing together is—" That night, Hester lay awake listening to the wind rattle the windows. In the spare room, she could hear Martha's soft snoring, another soul seeking sanctuary in her kitchen. Outside, coyotes howled at the sliver of moon. She thought about Dawson, sleeping in a cell, so lost to drink and debt that he'd throw her to the wolves to save himself. She thought about the bruises hidden under her sleeves, the years of making excuses, of believing that loyalty meant enduring anything. And she thought about Jed's words, "Not anymore." Maybe he was right. Maybe running wasn't the answer. Maybe it was time to stop letting fear choose her path. As if in response to her thoughts, thunder rumbled in the distance. Silas's storm was finally approaching, bringing change whether they were ready or not. Hester pulled her quilt higher and tried to find courage in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Dawson's release, Whitlow's manipulations, the town's judgment, but tonight, in her kitchen sanctuary, with Martha safe in the next room and the memory of Jed saying her name like a promise, Hester felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly, not yet, but maybe the first crack in the wall she'd built around her heart, maybe the beginning of believing she was worth defending. The thunder rolled closer. and the first fat raindrops began to spatter against the windows. Change was coming to Dust Creek. The only question was whether they'd weather it together or be torn apart. In her small bed, Hester McCrae made a decision. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone, and she wouldn't run. The storm broke in earnest just before dawn, but for the first time in years, the sound didn't frighten her. It sounded like cleansing. It sounded like a new beginning. The noon sun blazed down on Main Street as Hester carried her delivery basket toward Mabel's general store. The weekly ritual of bringing eggs and butter to town usually calmed her, but today her nerves jangled like spurs on a wooden floor. Dawson had been released from jail that morning, and she'd heard nothing from him since. The street bustled with unusual activity. Whitlow's men were everywhere, their city suits standing out like crows among sparrows. She kept her head down, focusing on her task, when a gust of prairie wind caught her sleeve. The fabric flipped back, exposing her forearm to the harsh sunlight. The bruises stood out livid against her pale skin, purple fingerprints with edges fading to sickly yellow-green. She moved to cover them, but it was too late. "Hester!" She turned to find Jed standing behind her, his face carved from stone. He'd seen, in that moment, with the bright noon sun illuminating everything she'd tried to hide. There was no pretending anymore. Without a word, Jed removed his own canvas jacket and draped it around her shoulders. The gesture was gentle but deliberate, performed in full view of the crowded street. The jacket engulfed her, warm with his body heat and smelling of leather and honest work. "Mr. Coulter," she began, but he was already turning away from her, his eyes fixed on something across the street. Dawson stood in front of the saloon, swaying slightly despite the early hour. His clothes were rumpled from his night in jail, his face flushed with drink and growing rage as he watched Jed's protective gesture. "Well, well," Dawson called out, his voice carrying across the street. "Ain't this cozy? My wife parading around town with another man's coat on her back?" The street traffic slowed as people sensed confrontation brewing. Hester felt exposed, pinned like a butterfly to a board by the weight of their stares. Jed's voice, when he spoke, was low but carried clearly. "I saw the bruises. Pike, we all see them now." A ripple went through the gathered crowd. Women clutched their shopping baskets tighter. Men shifted uncomfortably. This was the kind of private matter that wasn't supposed to be dragged into daylight. "A man's got a right to discipline his wife," Dawson snarled, starting across the street. "Especially when she's been making eyes at her employer." "That's enough." Jed's words stopped Dawson mid-stride. "You've lost any right to call yourself her husband. Real men don't leave marks on women." "You sanctimonious." Dawson's hand went to the knife at his belt, but Jed was already moving. "Sheriff Hart," he called out, never taking his eyes off Dawson. "I'd like to file a complaint." The sheriff emerged from the barber shop, half his face still covered in shaving soap. "Now, Mr. Coulter, you know domestic disputes ain't really... This isn't a domestic dispute anymore." Jed's voice carried the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "This is assault, witnessed by half the town, and I'm invoking the Cattlemen's Association Protection Statute." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The protection statute was an old rule, created to safeguard ranch workers from claim jumpers and rustlers. It had never been used for something like this. "You can't do that," Dawson protested. "She's my wife, not some hired hand." "She's my employee," Jed stated firmly. "Has been for 3 months. That makes her eligible for protection under the association rules." He turned to address the growing crowd. "I'm calling for community witnesses. Who here has seen Mrs. McCrae working at the Coulter Ranch?" There was a moment of heavy silence. Then Mabel Dunn stepped forward from her store entrance. "I have seen her working from dawn to past dusk, feeding everyone in sight." "I have too," Martha Washington added, her thin voice gaining strength. "She took me in when I had nothing, fed me from her own kitchen." One by one, Others stepped forward. Silas Crow, Tom Brennan, even some townspeople who'd never set foot on the ranch but had bought Hester's preserves or received her charity. "This is ridiculous." Dawson's face had gone from red to purple. "Sheriff, you can't let them—" "Actually," Sheriff Hart said slowly, wiping the last of the soap from his face, "the law's pretty clear. If Mr. Coulter wants to invoke protection for his employee, and if these folks are willing to witness—" He sighed heavily. "Mrs. McCrae, do you want protection?" All eyes turned to Hester. She stood there, drowning in Jed's jacket, feeling the weight of years of silence pressing down on her shoulders. This was the moment. Speak now or forever hold her peace. She thought of all the times she'd made excuses, all the bruises hidden under long sleeves, all the nights she'd lain awake wondering what she'd done wrong. Then she looked at the faces surrounding her, Mabel's fierce protectiveness, Martha's understanding, Jed's quiet strength. "Yes," the word came out as barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and said it louder. "Yes, I want protection." "You lying witch!" Dawson lunged forward, but suddenly found himself surrounded by ranch hands. Billy and Tom flanked him, their faces grim. "I'd think real careful about your next move." "Pike," Tom said quietly. Sheriff Hart stepped forward, his reluctance evident, but duty clear. "Dawson Pike, based on the witnessed complaint and the invocation of the protection statute, I'm ordering you to stay away from Mrs. McCrae for 48 hours while we sort this out legally." "This is a setup." Dawson's eyes darted wildly around the crowd, looking for allies and finding none. "Whitlow said you'd try something like this. Coulter said you'd use any trick to keep from selling your land." "Whitlow?" Jed's eyes sharpened. "What's Whitlow got to do with this?" But Dawson had realized his mistake. He clamped his mouth shut, glaring hatred at everyone around him. "Take him to the jail," Sheriff Hart ordered his deputy. "Let him cool off again. And Pike, next time you violate this order, it won't be just a night in a cell." As Dawson was led away, still shouting threats and curses, the crowd began to disperse. But the damage, or perhaps the healing, had been done. Hester's secret was out, naked under the prairie sun, and the town had chosen sides. "Come on," Mabel said briskly, taking Hester's arm. "Let's get you inside. You look ready to faint." But Hester stood firm. "No, not yet." She turned to face Jed, who'd remained silent through the aftermath. "What you did, invoking the statute, people will talk." "Let them talk," he said simply. "Talk is just wind. What matters is you're safe. For 48 hours. For a start." His jaw tightened. "I meant what I said. Hester, this ends now. No more hiding. No more pretending it's normal. You deserve better." "I don't even know what better looks like anymore," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "Then we'll figure it out together." He gestured to the crowd of supporters still lingering. "All of us. That's what community means." Whitlow appeared at the hotel entrance, his slicked hair gleaming in the sun. He watched the proceedings with calculating eyes, and Hester saw him make a note in his leather journal. Whatever game he was playing with Dawson, this had upset his plans. "Mrs. McCrae," the railroad man called out with false concern. "I do hope this unfortunate situation won't affect your husband's business proposals. We had such promising discussions." "The only business my husband has is sleeping off whiskey," Hester said, surprising herself with her boldness. "And any deals he might have made aren't worth the paper they're written on." Whitlow's smile tightened. "We'll see about that. Good day, ma'am." He tipped his hat mockingly and retreated into the hotel. As the crowd finally dispersed, Mabel insisted on taking Hester into the store for a cup of tea. Jed followed, his presence a silent wall between her and any lingering threats. "You know this isn't over," Mabel said once they were seated in her back room. "Dawson won't take this lying down, and that snake Whitlow is planning something." "I know." Hester wrapped her hands around the hot cup, letting the warmth seep into her bones. But for the first time in years, I'm not facing it alone. "Damn right you're not," Mabel said fiercely. "The women of this town have been whispering about Dawson Pike for too long. Time we did more than whisper." A knock at the door interrupted them. Silas poked his head in. "Boss, Ryder's coming. Looks like Whitlow's brought in some hired guns." Jed's face darkened. "So it begins." He looked at Hester. "I need to get back to the ranch. Ford up. You're welcome to come. Or Mabel can—" "I'm coming," Hester said firmly. "That kitchen is my responsibility, and—" She took a deep breath. "It's my home. The first real home I've had. I won't be driven from it." As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Hart appeared one more time. "Calter, a word of warning. Whitlow's been making noise about property rights and marriage laws. He's got a lawyer coming from the territorial capital." "Well, let him come." Jed said, "We've got right on our side." "Right doesn't always win against money and legal tricks," the sheriff cautioned. "Watch your backs." The ride back to the ranch was tense, with everyone scanning the horizon for trouble, but Hester felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a fierce protectiveness for the life she'd built. The people who'd stood by her, the sanctuary of her kitchen. As they crested the last hill before the ranch, Jed spoke quietly. "What you did today took courage." "It took you speaking up first," she replied. "You gave me the strength to find my voice." "You always had the strength. You just needed to know others would stand with you when you used it." The ranch buildings came into view, solid and welcoming in the afternoon light. Whatever storm was coming from Dawson, from Whitlow, from the changing world the railroad represented, Hester knew she'd weather it. Not alone this time, but as part of something larger. The bruises on her arm would fade, but the memory of this day, the day she stopped hiding, the day her community chose justice over comfortable silence, would remain forever. The dust storm hit 3 days after the confrontation on Main Street, just as Silas had predicted. It rolled across the prairie like a brown wall of fury, turning day to night and sending everyone scrambling for shelter. Hester fought to secure the kitchen windows while sand leaked through every crack, coating surfaces she'd just cleaned. "Here, let me get that corner." Jed appeared through the swirling dust, helping her wrestle a loose shutter into place. Together they worked to batten down the ranch, their movements synchronized by necessity. The storm forced everyone indoors, ranch hands huddled in the bunkhouse, horses secured in the barn, and an unexpected collection of refugees gathering in Hester's kitchen. Martha Washington had stayed on, helping with cooking in exchange for shelter. 2 more women had arrived that morning, Mrs. Chen, whose husband had died in a mining accident, and her young daughter. They'd been walking the roads, turned away from town after town, until Mabel sent them to the ranch. "Looks like your kitchen's becoming quite the haven," Jed observed, watching Hester efficiently organize sleeping spaces and meal preparations despite the howling wind outside. "People need somewhere safe," Hester replied, checking the pot of stew she'd started before the storm hit. "Especially now, with Whitlow stirring up trouble and folks choosing sides." The telegraph lines had been humming with news. Dawson's name was being linked to several shady land deals, with whispers that he'd been promised a percentage if he could pressure certain landowners to sell, including his own wife, if she'd inherited any claim through marriage. Speaking of trouble, Silas burst through the door, fighting to close it against the wind. "Boss, Ryder's coming. Can barely see them through the dust, but it looks like Whitlow's men, and—" He hesitated, glancing at Hester. "Pike's with them." Hester's hands stilled on the bread she was slicing. The 48-hour protection order had expired yesterday. She'd known Dawson would return, but she'd hoped for more time. "How many?" Jed asked, already moving toward the rifle rack. 6, maybe 7. Hard to tell in this mess. "Mrs. McCrae, you and the other women get to the root cellar," Jed ordered. But Hester stood her ground. "This is my kitchen," she said firmly. I'm not hiding in any cellar. Hester. No. She met his eyes steadily. I've done enough hiding. Whatever they want, they can say it to my face. Before Jed could argue, the door burst open again. But instead of Whitlow's men, it was Mabel Dunn, looking like she'd wrestled the storm itself. Behind her came several other townspeople, the minister's wife, the school teacher, even Mrs. Hartley, who ran the boarding house. Heard there might be trouble brewing, Mabel announced, shaking dust from her coat. Figured you could use some backup. This isn't your fight, Jed protested. Like hell it isn't. Mabel's language made the minister's wife gasp, but she didn't back down. When men start using the law to terrorize women, it becomes everyone's fight. Through the kitchen window, they could see the riders approaching, dark shapes in the swirling dust. Hester recognized Dawson's slouch in the saddle, the aggressive way he spurred his horse. Steady, Jed murmured, positioning himself near the door. The ranch hands had emerged from the bunkhouse, forming a protective line despite the storm. The riders reined up just outside the kitchen yard. Whitlow, immaculate even in the dust storm, remained mounted while Dawson swung down aggressively. Wife, Dawson shouted over the wind. Get out here, time to stop this foolishness and come home where you belong. She is home, Jed called back through the door. And you're trespassing. I've got legal papers. Dawson waved a document that the wind tried to snatch from his hand. Territorial judge says a wife's place is with her husband. Your made-up protection don't mean squat. Whitlow's voice carried with practiced authority. Mr. Kelter, I'd advise you not to interfere with the lawful reunion of a married couple. It could be costly. Everything's costly with you, isn't it? Whitlow! Mabel shouted from behind Jed. What'd you promise Pike a percentage of the Coulter ranch if he could drive Hester back to him? There was a telling silence before Whitlow replied. I don't know what you're implying, madam. I'm not implying anything. I'm saying it straight out. You're using this man's worst nature to get what you want. She pushed past Jed to stand in the doorway. Well, guess what the women of this town have been talking? Comparing notes. Funny how every family that's been pressured to sell has had some kind of trouble, sick cattle, poisoned wells, mysterious fires. Coincidences, Whitlow said smoothly. Patterns, Mabel shot back. And we've been documenting every one. During this exchange, Hester had been gathering her courage. Now she stepped forward. Still wearing Jed's jacket from 3 days ago, she'd found comfort in its protection. Dawson, she called out, her voice carrying surprising strength. I'm not coming with you, not now, not ever. You don't get to decide that. Dawson started forward, but stopped when several rifles appeared in the windows of the ranch house. You're my wife, the law says. The law says a lot of things. Sheriff Hart's voice interrupted as he rode up through the storm, a federal marshal beside him, including things about conspiracy to defraud, false testimonies, and forging legal documents. Dawson's face went white beneath the dust. What are you talking about? That paper you're waving. The marshal urged his horse forward. We got a telegraph from the territorial capital. No judge there issued any such order. In fact, they're mighty interested in who's been forging official documents. Whitlow's composure finally cracked. There must be some misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, Sheriff Hart said grimly. Just a lot of lies catching up. Marshal Stevens here has some questions for both of you. What happened next was swift. Some of Whitlow's hired men, seeing the way the wind was blowing, simply turned their horses and disappeared into the storm. Dawson made a desperate lunge toward Hester, screaming about his rights. But Tom Brennan's rope settled around him before he'd gone 2 steps. That's assault in front of a federal marshal. Stevens noted calmly, add it to the list. As Dawson was restrained, still ranting, his coat pocket tore open. Papers scattered in the wind, IOUs, gambling debts, and most damning, a contract promising him 20% of any land acquired through his influence over his wife. Hester stared at the swirling papers. Seeing her marriage reduced to its ugly truth, she'd been nothing but a potential asset to be leveraged. "I believe that's evidence of conspiracy," the marshal observed, gesturing for his men to collect what they could. "Mr. Whitlow, Mr. Pike, you'll both be coming with me." "This isn't over," Whitlow snarled, his polished veneer finally cracking completely. "The railroad has lawyers, influence, and they also have a reputation to protect." Stevens cut him off. "They won't thank you for dragging their name through a scandal. You overplayed your hand, Whitlow." As the two men were led away, Dawson twisted to look back at Hester one last time. "You did this!" he screamed. "You ruined everything you were supposed to be grateful you were supposed to." His words were lost in the wind as they dragged him away. Hester stood in the doorway, feeling strangely empty. She'd expected to feel triumphant, or at least relieved. Instead, she just felt tired. "It's over," Jed said quietly beside her. "Is it?" She watched the riders disappear into the dust. "He was right about one thing. We're still married. The law still says I belong to him. Laws can be changed," Mabel said firmly, "or worked around. There's talk of new legislation, divorce laws that protect women from violent husbands. Until then," she smiled grimly, "well, he can't very well claim his husbandly rights from federal prison." The storm continued to rage. But inside the kitchen, a different kind of atmosphere was building. The women who'd come to support Hester busied themselves with preparing food, creating an impromptu feast from whatever supplies were on hand. It was as if they all needed to do something life-affirming after witnessing such ugliness. "I never thanked you," Hester said to Jed as they worked side by side, preparing coffee for everyone. "For seeing the bruises, for speaking up." "No thanks needed," he replied gruffly. "Should have spoken up sooner." "You spoke when it mattered, when I was ready to hear it." She paused, then added softly, "I wasn't ready before. I thought enduring was the same as being strong." "You are strong," Jed said firmly. "Strongest person I know. You just needed reminding that strong doesn't mean alone." The storm began to die down as evening approached. As people prepared to leave, each woman stopped to speak with Hester words of support, shared stories, promises of continued help. A network had been revealed, or perhaps created, in the crucible of crisis. "My kitchen's become something more than I expected," Hester said to Mabel as they surveyed the room full of women helping each other. "It's become what was needed." Mabel replied, "A place where women can be safe, speak truth, find strength in numbers. That's more valuable than all Whitlow's railroad money." As the last guests departed, Hester stood in her kitchen, her sanctuary that had become a fortress, her workplace that had become a symbol of resistance. The storm had scoured the land clean, and she felt equally transformed. "What now?" she asked Jed, who'd lingered after everyone else left. "Now we rebuild," he said simply. "The storm took some shingles, knocked down fences. Tomorrow we fix what's broken and make it stronger than before." He was talking about the ranch, but they both knew he meant more than that. Hester nodded, understanding. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, legal battles over her marriage, the railroad's next moves, the slow work of healing. But tonight, in her kitchen that smelled of coffee and community, she felt ready to face whatever came. The dust storm had passed, leaving the air clear and sharp with possibility. And Hester McCrae, who had once believed herself powerless, stood at the center of a movement she'd never intended to start, a quiet revolution begun in a ranch kitchen, spreading through the women of Dust Creek like wildfire through dry grass. Change was no longer just coming. It had arrived, wearing an apron and wielding a coffee pot, backed by the power of women who'd decided enough was enough. The night was thick with tension when the sound of breaking glass shattered the peaceful darkness. Hester bolted upright from her cot in the small room off the kitchen, her heart hammering. Through the window, She could see torches moving in the yard, too many torches.
Fire in the barn.
Silas's voice rang out, followed by the clanging of the emergency bell. Hester threw on her wrapper and boots, rushing outside to find chaos. Flames licked at the corner of the barn while ranch hands formed a bucket brigade from the well. But the torches revealed more trouble, a group of men, faces covered with bandanas, circling the ranch buildings like wolves. Inside, now, Jed appeared at her elbow, rifle in hand, pushing her back toward the kitchen. This isn't about fire. It's about sending a message. Through the kitchen window, they could see Sheriff Hart and several deputies racing up the road, but they were still minutes away. The masked men grew bolder, one throwing a rock through the parlor window while another tried to kick in the bunkhouse door. "Dawson's friends from the saloon," Tom Brennan said grimly, taking position at another window. "Recognize that limp on the tall one, Jake Pardee, owes Pike money from cards."
"Where's Pike?"
someone called out, mockery clear in his voice.
"Heard his woman won't mind him. Maybe she needs better teaching."
Hester felt rage replace fear. These men thought they could terrorize her into submission, thought that without Dawson's presence they could break her will. They were wrong.
"Mrs. McCrae, get down,"
Jed started, but stopped as he saw her loading the shotgun with steady hands. "This is my home," she said quietly. "No one drives me from my home." The church bell in town began ringing the emergency signal that brought all able-bodied citizens running. Mabel's voice could be heard rallying the townswomen, and lights were appearing in windows across Dust Creek. One of the masked men approached the kitchen door, torch held high.
"Come on out. Cookie, your husband sent us to fetch you home."
"Dawson's in federal custody." Sheriff Hart's voice boomed as he and his men thundered into the yard. "And you're about to join him." What happened next would be remembered as the night Dust Creek truly chose its side. As the sheriff's men engaged the would-be attackers, the townspeople arrived, not just the men, but the women too, armed with rolling pins, skillets, and righteous fury. "You dare attack a woman in her home!" Mabel swung her iron skillet at Jake Pardee's head, dropping him like a stone. "You cowardly scum!" The fight was brief but decisive, outnumbered and facing an aroused community instead of one isolated woman. The attackers quickly threw down their weapons. The barn fire was doused before serious damage was done, though the smell of smoke lingered in the air. As the masked men were unmasked and arrested, a more disturbing truth emerged. Among them was Edward Carver, Whitlow's personal secretary, still carrying documents that revealed the railroad man's deeper scheme. "Look at this," Marshal Stevens said, examining the papers by lamplight. Whitlow wasn't just trying to buy land. He was documenting obstacles to progress, naming specific landowners who refused to sell, rating them by vulnerability. Hester's name was on the list, marked with notes. Husband controllable through debts. Wife shows signs of independence. Apply pressure through marriage laws. "They cataloged us." "Mrs.," Chen whispered, horror in her voice. "Like cattle for market."
"Worse,"
Jed said darkly. "They strategized how to break us." As dawn broke over the chaos, the full scope of what had happened became clear. This wasn't just about one violent husband or one greedy railroad man. It was about a system that saw people, especially women, as obstacles to be removed or resources to be exploited. "We need to call a town meeting," Hester said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her, surprised by the authority in her voice. "Not just the landowners or the men, everyone. If we're going to protect ourselves, we need to stand together." "She's right," Sheriff Hart agreed, looking older and more tired than usual. "This goes beyond what the law can handle alone. We need community justice." The meeting convened that afternoon in the church, the only building large enough to hold everyone. Hester found herself at the front of the room alongside Jed, Mabel, and the sheriff, an unlikely leadership council born of crisis. "We all know why we're here," Mabel began, her voice carrying to the back rows. Last night showed us that waiting for the law to protect us isn't enough. We need our own ways of keeping each other safe." "What are you proposing?" asked Reverend Mills. "Vigilante justice." "No." Hester stood, finding her voice stronger than expected. "Community protection. A network where no one faces threats alone." She looked around the room, meeting eyes with the women who'd sheltered in her kitchen, the men who'd formed the bucket brigade, the neighbors who'd answered the bells. "I propose we formalize what happened naturally last night." She continued, "A warning system bells, signals, a commitment that when one is threatened, all respond, and—" She took a deep breath. "A fund to help families escape dangerous situations, to start over if needed." "Who decides what's dangerous?" someone called out. "Who judges?" "We do," Jed said firmly. "As a community, public hearings, not backroom dealings, sunshine, not shadows." The debate continued for hours. Some argued it was too radical, others that it didn't go far enough. But gradually, consensus emerged. By evening, Dust Creek had its own protection compact, a document stating that violence against any community member was violence against all, that those seeking safety would find it, and that those who preyed on the vulnerable would face collective justice. "This is all well and good," a skeptical rancher named Hughes said. "But what about the law? What happens when Pike gets out of federal prison?" "Actually," Marshal Stevens stood up, "I received a telegraph this morning. Pike and Whitlow are being transferred to territorial prison to await trial. The federal prosecutor is very interested in this conspiracy. Seems Dust Creek isn't the only place where the railroad has used such tactics." A ripple of relief went through the room, followed by Hester's quiet voice. "But there will be others, other Dawsons, other Whitlows. That's why we need this compact, not just for now, but for always." As people signed the compact, Hester felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Jed, his expression soft with something she didn't quite dare name. "You did this," he said quietly. "You changed this town." "No," she corrected. "We did this. All of us. I just stopped being silent." That evening, as Hester served supper in her kitchen, now officially designated as a sanctuary space in the compact, she marveled at how much had changed. Martha Washington was teaching Mrs. Chen's daughter to read at one table. Mabel was organizing patrol schedules at another. The ranch hands came and went freely, no longer worried about propriety or appearances. "It's like a different world," Martha said wonderingly. "A month ago, I was starving and alone. Now you're family," Hester finished firmly. "That's what this is, a chosen family, bound by something stronger than blood or law." As night fell, Jed lingered after the others had gone to bed. They stood together on the kitchen porch, watching stars appear in the clear sky. "Hester," he began, then stopped, seeming to wrestle with words. "These past weeks, watching you find your strength, seeing you build this community, it's been like watching the sun rise after a long night." She turned to him, heart beating fast. "Jed!" "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I know you need time, need to figure out who you are without—" He gestured helplessly. "Without someone trying to control you. I just wanted you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here." Hester felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from a joy so unexpected it took her breath away. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me, for helping me see myself." They stood in comfortable silence, two people who'd found something precious in the midst of struggle. Inside, the kitchen stove crackled softly, keeping the sanctuary warm. Outside, the stars bore witness to a community transformed, a woman reborn, and the quiet promise of a future built on respect rather than fear. The compact signed that day would become legendary in Dust Creek's history the moment a town decided that justice meant more than law, that protection meant more than power, and that a cook with bruises on her arms could spark a revolution simply by refusing to hide anymore. But for now, It was just another night in Hester's kitchen, where the coffee was always hot, the door was always open to those in need, and hope grew stronger with every passing hour. The weeks following the compact signing brought a profound change to Dust Creek. Word spread quickly through the territory about the town that had stood up to railroad intimidation and created its own protection system. Some called it radical, others called it necessary. For Hester, it simply felt like breathing freely for the first time in years. She stood in her kitchen at dawn, kneading bread with sleeves rolled up to her elbows. The bruises had faded to mere shadows, soon to disappear entirely. No longer did she flinch at sudden movements or pull her sleeves down to hide the evidence of her past. "Morning, Hester." Martha Washington entered, tying on her apron. She'd become Hester's right hand in the kitchen, her timid demeanor replaced by quiet confidence. "The school teacher's coming for breakfast. She wants to talk about starting cooking lessons for the older students." "Both boys and girls?" Hester asked with a smile. "That's the revolutionary part," Martha laughed. "She says if everyone needs to eat, everyone should know how to cook." The kitchen had evolved into something more than a place for meal preparation. It was now the unofficial heart of the Protection Compact, where plans were made and lives were rebuilt. A large slate board on one wall showed the week's schedule: cooking lessons, reading groups, and what Mabel had dubbed independence training for women needing to learn skills their husbands had always handled. "Jed asked if you could spare a moment," Silas said, poking his head through the door. "He's in the barn with that new horse, the one nobody can handle." Hester dried her hands, curious. Jed had mentioned the horse, a mare that had been mistreated by her previous owner and now trusted no one. As she approached the barn, she could hear Jed's low, patient voice. "Easy, girl. Nobody's going to hurt you here. Take your time." She found him standing quietly in the center of the paddock, not approaching the mare, but simply being present, letting her get used to his presence. The horse stood in the far corner, ears flat, muscles tense. "She reminds me of someone?" Hester said softly, not wanting to startle either of them. Jed smiled without turning. "Thought the same. Figured maybe you could help. Sometimes healing recognizes healing." It was the closest he'd come to acknowledging what was growing between them, this careful, respectful dance of two people learning to trust again. Since that night on the porch, he'd maintained a gentle presence in her life. Never pushing, always supportive. "What's her name?" Hester asked, slowly entering the paddock. Previous owner called her Trouble. Thought she might deserve something better. Hester studied the mare, a beautiful animal beneath the fear, with intelligent eyes that tracked every movement. "Hope," she said finally, "if she'll accept it." Over the next hour, Hester sat quietly in the paddock, not trying to approach the mare, but simply existing in the same space. She talked softly about nothing in particular: recipes, the weather, stories from her childhood before life got complicated. Gradually, Hope's ears came forward, her stance relaxed. "You have a gift," Jed observed when the mare finally took a tentative step toward them. "Just patience," Hester replied, "and understanding that trust has to be earned, not demanded." Their eyes met, and the parallel wasn't lost on either of them. That afternoon, the kitchen filled with an unusual assembly. The territorial prosecutor had arrived to prepare for Dawson and Whitlow's trial, and he needed depositions from witnesses. Hester found herself recounting events she'd never spoken of before the escalating control. The violence disguised as husbandly correction. The way Dawson had tried to use her as a bargaining chip. "This is difficult, I know," the prosecutor, a Mr. Davidson, said gently. "But your testimony could help establish precedent. Other women in similar situations might find justice because of your courage." "It's not courage," Hester said quietly. "It's just finally understanding that silence protects the wrong people." After Davidson left, Mabel found Hester sitting alone in the kitchen, staring at her hands. "Regrets?" Mabel asked. "No," Hester said slowly. "Just wondering who I might have been if I'd spoken sooner, if I'd believed I deserved better from the start. Can't change the past, Mabel said practically. But you're changing the future. Do you know Elizabeth Garrett came to me yesterday? Her husband's been knocking her around for years. She wants to invoke the compact's protection. Hester's head came up. What does she need? Safe place to stay while she figures things out. Maybe work, if you have any. Send her here, Hester said immediately. We'll make room. That evening, the kitchen was fuller than usual. Elizabeth Garrett sat at the table, thin and nervous, but with a spark of determination in her eyes. The ranch hands treated her with careful courtesy, understanding without being told that she was under the compact's protection. Pass the potatoes, ma'am, Billy asked her politely, as if it were perfectly normal for the banker's wife to be dining at the ranch. The normalcy of it, the simple acceptance, brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes. I haven't sat at a table with others in years, she whispered. He said I wasn't fit company. Well, he was wrong, Tom Brennan said firmly. Good food tastes better with good company. I always say. After supper, as the kitchen emptied out, Jed lingered as had become his custom. He and Hester worked side by side cleaning up, their movements synchronized through practice. You're building something important here, he said, drying dishes as she washed. A place where people can start over. We're building it, she corrected. None of this would work without everyone's support. Without your support. He set down the plate he was drying and turned to face her fully. Hester, I need to say something, and I need you to know there's no pressure in it. Her hands stilled in the soapy water. The trial's coming up, he continued. Davidson says divorce proceedings can be started once Dawson's convicted. It'll be a scandal. But with the federal charges, you have grounds? He took a breath. What I'm trying to say is, when you're free, if you want to be, I'd like to court you, properly, the way you deserve. Hester felt her heart race, but it wasn't from fear this time. Jed? I know it's too soon to think about, he said quickly. I just wanted you to know my intentions are honorable, that I see a future where... He gestured helplessly at the kitchen full of evidence of their shared work. Where this partnership could be something more, if you're willing. She dried her hands slowly, gathering courage. Then she reached out and took his hand the first time she'd initiated physical contact with any man since that day on Main Street. I see it too, she whispered. Not yet, not while I'm still legally bound, but someday, yes. His face transformed with a smile so gentle it made her heart ache. He lifted her hand and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles, a gesture of old-fashioned courtship that somehow felt revolutionary in its respectfulness. Then I'll wait, he said simply. However long it takes. The next morning brought unexpected news. Sheriff Hart arrived with a telegram that set the kitchen buzzing. Railroad's pulling out, he announced. Seems the federal investigation has them scared. They're abandoning the Dust Creek route, going 50 miles south instead. There were mixed reactions, relief from those who'd fought the land grabs, worry from those who'd hoped for economic opportunities. But Hester noticed something else in the sheriff's expression. There's more, she said. It was a statement, not a question. Hart nodded grimly. Dawson Pike was killed last night. Prison fight. Seems he owed gambling debts even behind bars. The kitchen went silent. Hester sank into a chair, feeling strangely empty. Not grief exactly that had died long ago, but a peculiar hollowness where fear had lived for so long. Are you all right? Mabel asked softly. I don't know, Hester answered honestly. I thought I'd feel something more. Relief, freedom instead. I just feel numb. Elizabeth Garrett supplied quietly. I felt the same when my first husband died. You're so prepared to keep fighting. When the fight ends, you don't know what to do with yourself. Jed's hand settled gently on Hester's shoulder, warm and steady. You grieve, he said quietly. Not for what was, but for what might have been. For the person he could have been, the life you could have had. It's all right to mourn lost possibilities. That afternoon, Hester found herself at the small cemetery outside town. She didn't know why she'd come. Dawson would be buried in the prison graveyard, but she needed to mark the moment somehow. "I'm sorry," she said to the wind. "Sorry you lost yourself to anger and greed. Sorry I couldn't save you. Sorry we couldn't save each other." When she returned to the ranch, she found the kitchen transformed. The women had organized an impromptu celebration not of Dawson's death, but of Hester's life. The table groaned under dishes everyone had contributed, and someone had even brought out a fiddle. To new beginnings. Mabel toasted, raising a cup of Hester's famous coffee. To choosing our own paths. To the strongest woman in Dust Creek, Jed added quietly, his eyes on Hester. Who taught us all that courage looks like an open door and a pot of coffee? As the evening progressed, filled with music and laughter and the warmth of chosen family, Hester felt something shift inside her chest. The hollow space where fear had lived began to fill with something else possibility. Hope, the tentative beginning of joy. She caught Jed watching her from across the room and smiled. Really smiled. For the first time in years, he smiled back. And in that moment, the future seemed less like something to survive and more like something to embrace. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human struggles and triumphs. But inside Hester's kitchen, life went on messy, complicated, beautiful, and free. 6 months had passed since that night of music and new beginnings. The first train whistled through Dust Creek's new station, 50 miles south of the original route as promised. The town had adapted, finding ways to prosper without selling their souls to railroad schemes. And at the heart of it all, Hester's kitchen remained a beacon of warmth and community. The morning sun streamed through windows now adorned with cheerful gingham curtains, Mabel's contribution to what she called the new order of things. Hester moved through her domain with confident ease, no longer the woman who'd once flinched at shadows. 20 for breakfast this morning, Martha announced, consulting the ledger they now kept, including those 3 families traveling through on the train. The kitchen had officially become Hester's Cookhouse and Commons. With a painted sign out front that Silas had made, it served not just the ranch hands, but anyone needing a good meal and a safe haven. The protection compact had evolved too, becoming a model that other towns wrote asking about. Morning, Miss Hester. Young Tommy Chen burst through the door, his mother close behind. The boy had grown 2 inches and lost the haunted look he'd worn when they first arrived. Morning, Tommy. Ready to help with the biscuits? Hester had been teaching him to cook, despite some raised eyebrows about a boy learning women's work. Yes, ma'am, mister. Jed says I make the fluffiest biscuits in the territory. At the mention of Jed's name, Hester felt the familiar warmth in her chest. Their courtship had been slow and proper, exactly as he'd promised. Sunday rides to watch the sunset. Quiet conversations on the porch, his hand holding hers as they walked through town, reclaiming public affection as something gentle rather than possessive. Speaking of Mr. Jed, Martha said with a knowing smile. He asked if you could meet him by the new corral when you have a moment. Something about hope. Hope the mare who'd learned to trust again had become a symbol of sorts for all of them. Under patient care, she'd transformed from a terrified creature to one of the ranch's most reliable horses. Hester often rode her now, finding peace in their shared understanding. After the morning rush, Hester made her way to the corral. Jed stood by the fence, his broad frame relaxed, but with an underlying energy she'd learned to recognize. He was nervous about something. You wanted to see me, she asked, approaching with curious eyes. I did. He turned to face her, and she saw he was holding a small box. Hester, these past months, watching you build this place, seeing you help others find their strength, riding out to watch sunsets. He took a breath. I told you I'd court you properly. And I have. But I'm hoping. That is, I'm asking. Jed, she said softly, her heart racing. He dropped to one knee right there in the dusty corral, presenting a simple gold ring. Hester McCrae, you've taught me that love isn't about possession or control. It's about partnership, respect, and building something together. Will you marry me, not because you need protection or providence, but because I can't imagine facing another sunrise without you beside me? Tears blurred her vision, but they were tears of joy. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Jedediah Coulter, I'll marry you. He stood and slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly. Then, mindful of the ranch hands who'd mysteriously appeared to witness the moment, he kissed her softly, a promise of all the tomorrows to come. The wedding took place a month later, on a perfect autumn day when the prairie grass waved gold and the sky stretched endless blue. The entire town turned out, transforming the ranch into a celebration of community as much as matrimony. Sheriff Hart officiated, having gotten himself certified for the occasion. Never thought I'd see the day when a wedding felt like a victory for justice, he murmured to Hester before the ceremony. But here we are. Mabel served as matron of honor, resplendent in a new dress and her sharpest tongue. Anyone objects to this union, they'll answer to me in my skillet, she announced, earning laughter from the assembled crowd. Elizabeth Garrett, now working as the town's new teacher, played the piano they'd hauled from the church. Martha managed the feast preparations with military precision. Even Hope played a part, wearing flowers in her mane as she grazed peacefully nearby, a living reminder of how far they'd all come. Do you, Hester, take this man to be your husband? Sheriff Hart asked. To stand beside him as an equal partner, to build a life based on mutual respect and honest love. I do, Hester said clearly, her voice carrying to the back of the crowd. And do you, Jedediah, take this woman to be your wife, to honor her independence even as you share your lives, to support her dreams as she supports yours? I do, Jed replied, his eyes never leaving Hester's face. Then by the power vested in me by the territory and witnessed by this community that stands as family to you both, I pronounce you husband and wife. The cheer that went up could probably be heard at the train station 50 miles away. The reception flowed naturally into the kind of gathering Hester's kitchen had become famous for: good food, better company, and the warmth of people who'd chosen to stand together as twilight painted the sky purple and gold. Jed and Hester stood on their porch, watching their friends and chosen family celebrate below. No regrets? Jed asked softly, his arm around her waist. None, Hester replied firmly. This is what I never dared dream of, a life where love means freedom, not captivity. What now? He asked. What do you want to build next? Hester looked out at the gathering at Martha teaching a new recipe to a group of young women, at Silas demonstrating rope tricks to fascinated children, at Mabel organizing what sounded like a suffrage meeting in the corner. The Protection Compact banner hung from the barn, a reminder of how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. I want to expand the cookhouse, she said. Add rooms for women who need sanctuary while they rebuild. Maybe start a school for practical skills cooking. Yes, but also accounting, animal care, anything that helps people stand on their own feet. The Hester McCrae, Coulter Institute for Independence, Jed suggested with a smile. Something like that. She turned in his arms to face him. Will you help me? Always, he promised. That's what partnership means. As the stars came out one by one, the first train of the evening whistled in the distance. Dust Creek had survived the railroad's threats and emerged stronger. The town that had once looked away from Bruises now stood as a beacon for those seeking justice and second chances. Inside the cookhouse, someone started a song, one of those old ballads about home and belonging. Voices joined in, harmonizing imperfectly, but with genuine feeling. Hester listened, her hand in Jed's. and marveled at the journey that had brought her here. She'd started as a woman hiding bruises under long sleeves, cooking before dawn to avoid confrontation. Now she stood as co-owner of a thriving ranch, founder of a movement, and partner to a man who saw her strength as something to celebrate, not suppress. "Thank you," she whispered to the night sky, to the God who'd seen her through, to the community who'd stood with her, to the man beside her who'd waited patiently for her to heal. The kitchen door stood open, spilling light and laughter into the prairie darkness. Above it, the new sign caught the lamplight. Kelter Cookhouse and Commons, where everyone has a seat at the table. It was more than a business name. It was a promise, a philosophy, a declaration that in this corner of the frontier, dignity wasn't dependent on gender or wealth or who you'd been before. Here, everyone could find sanctuary, second chances, and the revolutionary idea that they deserved both safety and joy. As the celebration continued into the night, other women pulled Hester aside, some to share their own stories of escape, others to ask about bringing the protection compact to their communities. The movement that had started in one kitchen was spreading across the territory like prairie fire. "You lit a match," Mabel told her as the evening wound down. "Now watch it burn away all the old, rotten ideas about what women can and can't do." Standing there surrounded by chosen family, with her husband's hand warm in hers and her future bright with possibility, Hester McCrae. Kelter smiled. She'd learned that sometimes the greatest revolutions begin not with grand gestures, but with small acts of courage, like rolling up your sleeves to show the truth, speaking the word no, or opening your kitchen door to those in need. The bruises were long gone, but their memory had transformed into something powerful, a determination that no one else would suffer in silence, that kitchens could be sanctuaries, and that love, real love, meant standing beside someone as they became their truest self. As the last guests departed and the prairie night settled into peaceful quiet, Hester looked at her kitchen one more time before closing the door. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people seeking sanctuary, new battles for justice and dignity. But tonight, she was simply a woman who'd found her voice, her strength, and her home. And that, she thought as Jed's arms encircled her, was more than enough. It was everything. The first train whistle of dawn would find her where she belonged in her kitchen, brewing coffee strong enough to wake the dead, ready to feed both body and soul to anyone who needed it. But now she wouldn't be alone. She'd never be alone again. And somewhere in the territory, another woman with hidden bruises might hear about Dust Creek, about the cook who'd stood up to a violent husband and a corrupt railroad, about the town that had chosen justice over comfortable silence, about the kitchen where anyone could find sanctuary. She might pack a small bag and buy a train ticket, heading toward hope. The revolution continued, one cup of coffee at a time. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what this tale meant to you. If you enjoyed this Western story of courage and community, please subscribe to Wild West Night, like this video, and hit the hype button to help more people discover this story of hope and transformation. Your support helps these important narratives reach those who need to hear them most.